this is a really important story to tell, and to understand this is particularly now, because as I was saying before, race is central to our story. Race, race, race. And a lot of people don't like that. And a lot of people don't want to hear about it.
Welcome to the End Game. This is episode 32, and we're very honored to have as our guest Kevin Thompson, a professor at South Carolina who wrote his PhD while at the University of Alabama about Bear Bryant and how many of the myths about him as a leader of college football integration are not true. Obviously, that matches up a lot with what I do, telling the story about Duffy Daugherty at Michigan State and the other true pioneers of the 1960s. First, let me introduce my co-host, Bajan Bain. He is pinch hitting for my regular co-host, Herman Bulls. Bajan is an author. He's written a book about Elgin Baylor, basketball in Martha's Vineyard, and he's also a very knowledgeable media and TV and culture critic. If you watch the documentary After Jackie, which is about the first black players making their mark in Major League baseball, after Jackie Robinson, Bajan is interviewed for that. And we're doing a lot of the similar stuff here about the first black football players in the South and Michigan State's leadership, right, Bajan?
Yeah, we sure are.
And Bajan, let's welcome Kevin Thompson. Kevin, I've talked to a lot of media in Alabama, and they tell me that I've got it right about these myths about Bear Bryant, but they won't put me on their shows, their radio shows, or write a story about it. And so it's been a pleasure to get to know you and kind of validate all the research I've done and the story. So, welcome to the show. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for inviting me on the show. Big fan of your work and really enjoy talking about football history and just sports history. So my name is Kevin Thompson. I'm a professor at University of South Carolina in the English department. And most of my research involves myth making in sports and in particular mythology of Paul Bear Bryant was the topic of my dissertation. And when I was at the University of Alabama for 3 years doing my PhD, I was struck by the amount of like football iconography and just football symbols all throughout campus, but especially houndstooth. That was like one of the first things that I noticed, that everybody was wearing houndstooth on games days. And I was like, what is this really weird phenomenon? Everybody dresses up differently compared to like when I lived in Texas for most of my life, how they treated football, right? So I thought in Texas, where the old adage is football's like a religion, I thought that that was unique to Texas. And it wasn't. It's just rebranded in a different way, like at the University of Alabama. And I think a large part of that builds up into the myth of what we know as Paul Bear Bryant. So a lot of my research is in that realm, and that's a little bit about me. So.
Okay, and then you wrote your dissertation about this as a University of Alabama student, which I find shocking that you got it approved and got your PhD. Let's go through some of the points you make in your dissertation because there's a lot to digest. It's an excellent job. But one of the points you make is that the Paul Bear Bryant Museum on campus is dishonest about the storytelling of Bear Bryant's role in college football integration. And that's true. That carries over to college football lore and the national sports media. They cast him as a crusader. He actually was dragging his feet. Alabama was the seventh of 10 SEC schools to recruit a black player in football. And by the 1970 season, with the USC game and the myths about Sam Cunningham's influence, 33 of 37 major Southern programs included black players. The true story is Bear Bryant was playing catch up.
No, yeah, I think that that's a great way of characterizing it. He was playing catch up, and I think that you mentioned the museum. That's a big part of my dissertation. It's the first chapter. And one of the things that I wanted to do before I really got into this research process of trying to understand what are the implications, how does this impact the fandom? That is, how do these myths about Paul Bear Bryant being the civil rights trailblazer, how do these myths about Paul Bear Bryant affect the fandom, right? And I felt like there are a few better places to really diagnose that, to really understand that, than at his namesake museum, which is located on campus. And to go not just like look at the museum and understand what messages are happening in the museum, but to also watch fans go through the museum, like on a busy game day. Like, what are the things that they're drawn towards? How does this affect the average Bama fan? And some of my findings were pretty telling, that not only are the messages that are about Bear Bryant being like a civil rights barrier breaker, as he is, that's what the exhibit is called in the museum, breaking barriers through Paul Bear Bryant. I not only found that a lot of folks weren't very interested in that exhibit because it's located interestingly in like the back of the museum, but two, most of the fans are most concerned about the trophies and all the fun shiny objects that you can put your fingers on. And it's interesting how like all being surrounded by all of the winning really obfuscates the truth of what he really was, which, as you said at the top, he drug his feet.
Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, the other point is Auburn with James Owens was the first black player 1 year before Bear Bryant signed his first black player, which puts to rest any of the myths George Wallace was tying Bryant's hands behind his back. Bajan, your comments. One thing that you've always I've said that I found interesting is the Disneyfication of these stories about Bear Bryant and the 1966 NCAA basketball game with Texas Western.
Yeah, I often make that analogy so that it's not, isolated to Bryant's legacy or college football, and some people that are not as familiar or don't know about the purported Cunningham influence might be, depending on the generation or depending on whether they saw the film Glory Road, more familiar with the fabrication about the role of Don Haskins' team and college basketball trajectory, especially since it's not to take anything away from that team. It's not to say that they didn't start the lineup that they did start, but to add in the film things like the pep talk that Haskins supposedly had the night before in Cold Field House, and the fictitious announcement to his team during that team meeting the night before the NCAA championship game that he was going to start, Artis and Worsley and Shedd and Flournoy, and to imply that those weren't the Norton Cager, to imply that those weren't the regular starters during the year, when they really only played about 7 people all year, even though they weren't all black. And the first 2 guys off the bench, one of them wasn't black, probably 2, because Jerry Armstrong played. but he really didn't play a deep bench, and he wouldn't have had a conversation like that in the bleachers of Cole Fieldhouse the night before the game because his roster was pretty relatively thin for a team that made it to the Final Four, and everybody already knew, the Worsley and Bobby Joe Hill were going to be the starting guards, and usually Dave Latin was starting in the pivot, and that Flournoy and Cager usually played on the wing. So it wasn't like some racial thing or some let's show Adolph Rupp, who's boss, or let's make a statement for race. And in Sports Illustrated the week after the game, as both of you know, I think Frank DeFord might have written the feature.
Right.
It was actually the cover story with Riley and Flournoy contesting for the same rebound. And there's no, I'm not to say that this is not to take anything away, not to say it's not monumental, not to say that it didn't have any effect on recruiting or Southwestern recruiting or Southern recruiting, but in the moment, the lineups weren't even mentioned in most accounts of the game immediately thereafter, particularly in DeFord's account of the game. And to go back to football, the reasoning is that it's not that it wasn't unprecedented. If you want to say, well, maybe 5 is unprecedented. But Loyola Chicago had played 4 black starters in their 63 triumph over Cincinnati, which had probably started at least 3.
3, that's right.
In that double overtime game. And you'd have the Michigan teams with Bill Bunton and Cassie Russell and Oliver Darden as 3. University of San Francisco with Gene Brown and Casey Jones and Bill Russell in the 50s with 3 black starters. And it wasn't unusual for people to make it to the Final Four with a majority black lineup, including Utah in the same Final Four that Kentucky Western and that Texas Western and Kentucky were involved in. So just as in football, where you have people like you have Georgia Tech with Eddie McShann, who played quarterback the same season as the Sam Cunningham game, started in the Deep South. His first, technically you could make a case he's the first black quarterback to start a game at a major in the Deep South. It was the same fall, the same 1970 season as the Cunningham game. You could say that was influential. Yeah, you could say that was influential. You could say Jimmy Ray or Jimmy Jones quarterbacking at USC, or you could say, to your point, James Owens signing at Auburn, or the gentleman that signed at Kentucky. The 3 gentlemen that signed in the late 60s were easily as influential. And because it doesn't involve a mythic figure like a Rupp or a Bryant, it's not as rife for Disneyfication as some of the narratives that are actually true. I mean, Jerry Levias started in the Southwest, and a half decade before that, and so did Warren McVeigh.
Yeah. Yeah, and those 2 Kentucky players, Nate Northington and Greg Page, had signed their commitments to Kentucky before the Kentucky UTEP basketball game. So Kentucky was already making progress that way. But Adolph Rupp just looked like a racist, a Southern racist, so that helped sell the myth. But the entire, and I agree with Bijan here, this is not criticism of Sam Cunningham. The entire premise of the USC-Alabama game myth that Bear Bryant came up with a secret plan to schedule USC in 1970 to have his team lose. He wanted them to lose. He wanted to shock his fan base into letting him recruit black players when he had already signed black players. Wilbur Jackson had signed 8 months earlier before the game, is all part of the myth. And one part of your dissertation, Kevin, is you talk about how this barrier breakers display tries to pull off the picture Bear Bryant was taking cautious baby steps. Well, the brave guys making baby steps throughout the 60s, like Jerry Levias, are the ones that deserve the credit. Your comments, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I was taken aback by this Disneyfication comment that Bijan made, because I think that it's absolutely right, because these higher or than life kind of figures, these mythic figures like Rupp or like Bryant, um, I feel like they, because of the myths that surround them, they become this like vehicle for their respective like institutions, universities, fans, to like really soak in that myth. And one thing that I wrote down when you mentioned Disney and Disneyification, to me, when I think of Disney, I think of my childhood movies, and in particular, this quote from the museum, the Breaking Barriers exhibit that you mentioned, Tom. Uh, to me is just the pure infantilization of action, right? That Bear Bryant, according to the museum, and I'll read the quote from the museum in a second, but essentially, it shows that he was trying to do things in the right way by going slow and incremental. When in reality, as you know, Tom has mentioned, as you have mentioned, Bijan, several times, there are plenty of other universities throughout the country that are already integrating to this point. In specifically the Breaking Barriers exhibit, what it says is it took 27 years into his 38-year career before he had an African American player take the field for one of his teams. It wasn't from a lack of understanding or want to, but because it was baby steps, a lot of them. And to me, that is this Disneyification. It is not just the mythos behind it, which is just a flat out lie, right? That he had all of these incremental steps to try to integrate Alabama football. It's also that like it's kind of like belittling the action that he could have done, right? To that point, because it's not just that he was the head coach, he was also the athletic director, and arguably the most powerful athletic director in the country. And so to the assumption that it was just a bunch of incremental steps, nowhere does it actually detail what those steps were, right? But we do in the museum, but we do know that there are a lot of things that don't comport with um, the myth that he took a bunch of baby steps, and that includes um, video evidence of him talking poorly about black athletes around this time, saying that they were too uneducated to be recruited to his teams, right? And so there is a whole lot there that the museum tries to claim that there are these baby steps that he did. When to me, that's infantilization of what he didn't do and what he could have done.
Yeah, and the point I've always liked to make, if he really was trying to do something, in the 1967 spring football, he had 5 black players try to make the team as a walk-on,
Mm-hmm.
and he cut them all. Now, back we have to remember in those days, Bear Bryant was recruiting guys just so they wouldn't play at Auburn in Mississippi. He had 140 guys on his roster. You're telling me that the best of those 5 black kids couldn't play with the worst of those 140 white kids? Here was an open door to make a statement, and he didn't take it. He not only didn't take it, in a 1967 spring football interview when he was confronted with not having any black players, he said he couldn't find any that were academically qualified.
Mm-hmm.
It's laughable,
Well, see,
especially when
that
you can.
speaks to the Namath myth. The academically qualified, Namath couldn't get into Kentucky. Namath couldn't get into
Yes.
Maryland, despite cramming all summer with a tutor in College Park to try to get his college board scores up to the minimum requirement to enroll in the University of Maryland. And he ends up at Bama. And I'm not knocking Joe Namath. He's a childhood hero of mine. And Namath was very friendly to Vivian Malone, and he was criticized by his teammates when they saw his high school yearbook that he, hung out with black guys, had black teammates, and supposedly in one picture in the yearbook, he's actually posing with a high school student that was a black young lady, and the rumor circulated among his teammates that they dated, which they didn't. So I know he went through a lot of flack as a Northerner playing on that team, and even to the point where he was mistaken once for, for being a black person when he was up in the tower talking with Bear on a recruiting trip, and he had on like a hat, and it was kind of like a pork pie hat, and it was kind of cocked at a Namath-esque angle, and he had on like a really nice sports coat, and like only Namath would wear in the early 60s. And some observers supposedly saw, you could only see like a vision of them talking to each other up in Bear's Tower. And he asked somebody like a bystander or a player or somebody on the Alabama staff, who's that end sports writer up in the tower talking to Bear? You know, because Namath is kind of tan. So I'm not knocking Namath, but if you're going to talk about these 7 guys, and I can't find anybody because of academic qualifications, the reason Namath defaulted to Bama was because Namath couldn't get into the 2 schools that he was really that if everything else had been equal, Namath would have been enrolled in. And that, the reason I mentioned that myth is because it ties into the whole thing about Bear sending Charlie Thornhill to Michigan State or some kind of craziness that also didn't happen. And I want to also backtrack on something that both of you have alluded to, is that when you have these narratives about, well, Rupp had this revelation or epiphany, Bear had this revelation or epiphany, not only is it mythical, and not only to Tom's point and to our guest point, that it detracts from people that were real trailblazers, but they're not even as rich as the real stories. The real Namath story about cramming all summer, if you're a journalist or a sports museum, is a much richer story than the fake story. The real story is about Lenny Lyles playing running back at the University of Louisville in the mid-1950s. Is much richer than saying Sam Cunningham scored some touchdowns. So all of a sudden Bear was like, oh, I got to recruit some of these guys. Let me walk into the locker room and congratulate them and change my recruiting. No, that's not what Rupp and Bear did. I mean, they knew about black athletes. Mm-hmm. They were, to the point where let's go to the other extreme of how aware they were about the prowess of black athletes in the South, in the deep South, in terms of recruiting. In the SWAC conference, by the end of the decade of the 1960s, Grambling had more first and second round draft picks than USC and Notre Dame combined. Grambling's in Louisiana. It's not that far from LSU. So a lot of those kids would have been at LSU if the Southeastern Conference had been integrated. Florida State, and I'll leave it at this point. Florida A&M had a team in the 1961 season that beat their opponents, the first, I think it's 5 or 6 opponents, they beat by an average score of 61-6. They beat a Texas Southern team that had Homer Jones, Charlie Frazier, W.K. Hicks, and the Jets' future All-Pro tackle Winston Hill on it. They beat that team 48-20. Now, those kids like Bob Hayes and Bob Paramore and Clarence Childs and Alfred Denson, they would have been at Miami of Florida. They would have been at Florida State, or they would have been at the University of Florida if those schools had been integrated. They'd have been dispersed to the big state schools. So by the mid to late 80s, Bobby Bowden's getting those kids. Florida's getting those kids. Howard Schnellenberg is getting those kids. By the late 80s, those 3 schools are in the top 10 because the kids that would have been by law and by Jim Crow sort of naturally funneled to Florida A&M to the point where they're beating people like 60-3. I mean, they're beating good teams like 48-20 that have 5 feature pros on the teams. Warren Wells was also on that Texas Southern team that got beaten 48-20 by that 61 Florida A&M team. Those kind of people were like first round NFL draft choices. So the Southern coaches knew about those kind of guys. They were right in their backyards.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing the lengths Bear Bryant's sycophants, and I include people in the national media, uh, go about protecting his myth. And another point in your dissertation, Kevin, you talk about protecting Bear Bryant's myth, the museum protecting his myth, going all the way back to his days at Kentucky in the late 40s and early 50s.
Yeah, I was really I'm interested in this part of the museum because for the most part of the museum, I would say about like 95% of the museum is dedicated to just Alabama football and its history, right? And there are really only two other mentions of other universities significantly other than just these were the opponents, right? And those are Texas A&M, where Bryant had a job before he went to Bama, and also University of Kentucky, where he had a job before that. And I found it interesting that the only mentions are just blips of his time in Kentucky, um, and that he was, quote, lifelong friends with uh, uh, Coach Rupp for the rest of his life. It kind of plays up this kind of he was just a really friendly guy and had good relationships with people without really going into any of that history. But, I didn't know until I went into the archives how significant of a racist Coach Rupp was. And all of his, uh, 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 for honestly, it was just problematic coaching and white supremacist kind of actions and the fact that he was quote unquote lifelong friends with him, as it says in the museum, it kind of goes to show the birds of a feather flock together. And uh, I I do find it interesting too, and John, I don't want to miss your point that there is a whole lot more under these stories that are frankly better stories to talk about. If we focus on just like the Rupps and the Bryants of the world, we're missing a whole lot.
Lot.
Because these, I like to think of this as work, right? And that is athletics as work, and these are workers that are creating the product.
Yeah,
Um, you know, I find it interesting, for example, when it's talking about Bryant's integration at UA, just to fast forward from University of Kentucky, um, that it it talks about Wilbur Jackson and John Mitchell, but it doesn't talk about what caused him to reach out to those athletes and offer them scholarships. For example, I did some digging through the UA archives and I found out that the Alabama Black Student Union, as well as the civil rights attorney UW Clemson in Tuscaloosa, sued the athletics department in July of 1969 for not recruiting black athletes. And it was literally the next month in August where we start to have more momentum towards the recruitment of Wilbur Jackson, John Mitchell. And frankly, the only reason I even found this in the archives was that this was a case that was oversaw by J. Edgar Hoover himself. And I was going through and typing in keyword searches like Hoover, Alabama, and I found
Mm.
J. Edgar Hoover pop up in my search, and I was like, "What is this?" And sure enough, it was something that was even studied at the highest level of the FBI at the time. And I find it interesting that we have all of these big names, and it being a huge systematic surveillance of the actions of these white coaches to integrate black athletes, and yet very little is talked about the experience of those black athletes other than the kind of cherry picked handful of like, well, this person had a great time, right? Kind of like the Cunningham example that Bijan talks about, where somebody threw a bunch of touchdowns when there's a lot more there, right? There are cross burnings happening on the University of Alabama's campus months before Wilbur Jackson and John Mitchell arrived, right? And yet there is very little conversation about what life was like for other athletes at the time, right? Or black athletes that were trying to be a part of the team during cross burning on their own campus.
Hate mail from boosters, hate mail from fans. Don't start these guys. I'm gonna get rid of my season. I'm gonna cancel my season, tickets. media.
It begs the question, why is it that the University of Alabama is so interested in not telling those stories? And it it it's a very complicated and problematic history. It seems like we don't seem to be learning from.
And
Man's a
again,
mythical figure in the state.
yeah. And again, it's not just that we're pointing out Bryant didn't do all these things. It's a false narrative. We're pointing out it's an injustice to the true pioneers. Bob Grant was excited to go to Michigan State and ride the Underground Railroad in 1964 along with Jimmy Ray until Wake Forest decided it was going to desegregate. Bill Tate was their new coach, and he had the backing of the president and the athletic director. And one of the first coaches Bill Tate called in North Carolina was the high school coach of Bob Grant in Jacksonville, North Carolina, Georgetown High School. And the coach there, a black man, of course, it was a black school, convinced Bob that he could change history and open doors for other black kids if he went there. And so Bob almost reluctantly went there because he was excited to play for Duffy Daugherty. And when he was making his plans, Bob's grandmother didn't want him to go. She told him that those white boys are going to kill you in your sleep. Jerry Levias, when he played at Texas, a midseason game in Austin, the fans were waving nooses at him. This is his sophomore year, first year you can play varsity back in those days. They travel to TCU to clinch the Southwest Conference title, and the FBI deemed the death threats against Levias to be true. People literally thought he was going to get shot dead on the field, and Jerry Levias performed. He scored a touchdown under that kind of pressure. You don't hear these stories. Those were the baby steps. You're telling me that Sam Cunningham, who by his own admission ran through mammoth holes to gain his yards against Alabama, is a bigger hero than Bob Grant or Jerry Levias or Nate Northington, Greg Page, James Owens, all these guys making the baby steps? It's a crime. It's absolutely ridiculous, and that's why I'm so passionate about this subject and persistent and hoping we can continue to tell the story. And let me back up to Kentucky here. This is another story you don't hear. And the reason being is in 1960, the media before the Mexico City Olympics with Tommy Smith and John Carlos protests tried to avoid race in the sports media. I'm talking. Of course, Martin Luther King's Civil Rights March movement was covered. They avoided it. So all these steps that were milestones were being ignored. And a good example of that, going back to Bryant's days at Kentucky in 1947. Actually, I'll start in 1946. Michigan State played at Kentucky, and in those days there was a gentleman's agreement that when northern teams played in the South, they would bench their black players, and that's what Michigan State's coach Charlie Bachman did. And history has shown him to not really care about race. Well, the next year, 1947, Biggie Munn is hired as the head coach, and he's got an assistant coach on his staff, Duffy Daugherty. And the mainstream media wrote zero about this, but the black paper in Detroit, the Michigan Chronicle, was covering it. What is this new coach at Michigan State going to do? Is he going to follow the gentleman's agreement? Biggie Munn, when Bear Bryant saw Biggie Munn, had Horace Smith, a halfback, warming up on the field with the team, and there was one other black player on the team at the time, but Horace Walker was a pivotal player. Bear Bryant kept his team on the sidelines for 10 minutes. That's one of the oral histories. Again, it's not written about in the mainstream media. And as a form of protest, and then the game finally resumes. You never hear that story about Bear Bryant. Yeah, talk more about that part of Bear Bryant's history, Kevin.
Yeah, when it comes to a lot of Bryant's history before Bama, a lot of the archives in Alabama are just about his time in Alabama. And so, you know, I have a limited understanding of his time at Kentucky, but I will say that a big part of my dissertation does take me to Junction. And I don't know if I'm getting it too ahead of myself.
No, go ahead.
But I think that it's very important for us to talk about and be a part of um, his history and how it's talked about and understood, that what happened in Junction was wrong, illegal, and the atypical definition of abuse on every level: physical, verbal, mental. Um, you know, there are things that I found, because my dissertation research did take me to um, Junction, where, you know, I'm originally from Texas, and so I was able to kind of navigate easily uh and it's, you know, in the huge state. But it did take me from Junction to like some surrounding communities, and I went and talked with people, including talking with um widows of people that were at the camp. And while I can't get too much into things because of like IRB law and whatnot, what I can say from what is on the record is they do not think very fondly. That is, the people that have the living memory of Bryant and his time before he went to Bama, they do not have fond memories of him. And I think that it's interesting that even the historical marker that exists in Junction, Texas, talks about that history as though it was generative for the future success that Bryant had coaching his players. That basically the abuse that was endured in Junction um, was necessary for him to get his championship DNA. And nothing can be farther from the truth, right? There are tons of champions out there that have great coaching, that you don't have to be stuck through the ringer in order to be a champion. But you know, there is this long pattern of literally from his first jobs at or his first like big jobs where he is no longer an assistant but like a head coach, from Kentucky to Texas A&M to University of Alabama. There is a long history at every single institution that he is at very minimum flirting with, you know, and I say that not in like the traditional way, but like flirting with racists, buddying, cozying up with people that are extremely violent to other athletes, right? And then he himself also starts espousing the same kind of behavior towards his athletes. Um, and there's only one book about it, and it's written by a guy that unfortunately has had a lot of his credibility taken away because he got arrested for DWI, right? And so like it sucks because that's one of the only living pieces of textual memory that we have of what happened in Junction. But what happened in Junction, which preceded what happened in Bama and happened right after what happened in Kentucky, was a full lash out. People had to be rushed to the hospital. They suffered seizures and lifelong injuries because of what he did there. And so it does, if this stuff isn't talked about like what we're doing now, then it's going to be lost. So I you know, I think that it's very important that people, especially in the Bama fandom, don't just look at the championships. Don't just look at Alabama in a vacuum, and look at the man before he came there, because Rupp will tell you a lot about him and his relationship with him, and he'll also learn a lot. We'll also learn a lot about his relationship with the Aggies down in A&M.
Yeah. Um, and the other thing is that story was romanticized by ESPN into the film.
Junction
Ironically,
Boys.
ironically they had David Halberstam write a review of it, and he doesn't write a very flattering story. But Halberstam also felt compelled to address Bryant's failures in that story at Alabama, and he says he was not a leader. Coach is judged as a leader, and he was not a leader. He did not live up to the times. Okay, well, let's start to wrap this up. One more point I want you to comment, Kevin, about your dissertation is the Bryant Museum tries to make Bear Bryant sound like this kindly old grandfatherly figure as he has a conversation with Wilbur Jackson. Oh, Wilbur, if anything happens to you, let me know.
Yeah, it's very how Brian is constructed in the museum, and this is a significant argument I make in the first chapter, is that he is this very um larger than life paternal figure. Um and that makes sense to Alabama fans because his name is on every street, it's on every like sports venue, right? The Bryant Denny Stadium's named after the man. They hear his voice at the football games, right? And so you hear him, you see him, you feel him all the time, but he's still out there, just like a lot of dads are, right? And at this in the same vein, um, in the museum itself, there's a lot of like looking up at him. It's interesting that all of his portraits are kind of elevated up, right? Of like on the wall, versus some of the other pictures are kind of like at eye level, right? And so you have to look up at him. Um, Moreover than that, there's elements of the museum that uh, go to talk about how he would take care of players, and in particular, the video that you mentioned, that has was it Wilbur Jackson?
Yes, Wilbur
Yeah,
Jackson.
it was Wilbur Jackson in this University of Alabama video that they released when they were recognizing the efforts. The university was recognizing the efforts. Of John Mitchell and Wilbur Jackson. And so they constructed this like PR kind of style video, the university did, where Wilbur says in the video, and you can find this on YouTube, it still exists. If there's any problems, apparently Bear Bryant said this to Wilbur Jackson when he was being recruited at his house. He said he took him aside at his house and said, if there's any problems on campus, you just need to come to me. And this idea that one person can solve all of our problems uh, is something that we're still like feeling today. But it's all very paternal, and it's used as a method in this instance of control, right? There is nothing of me to believe that Bryant wasn't trying to control the narrative about the problems of that are associated with racial integration in Alabama at the time. He wanted to quash those as much as he could, and I think he wanted to have as much control over that narrative as he could. And so he was individually telling these black athletes, "Just come to me if you have any problems." Interestingly, we don't know about any of those meetings, and it's really hard to get into, Brian's notes or diaries at the time without significant I don't know, Freedom of Information Act or subpoena power, right? It's hard to know really the depths to which the how those conversations transpired, but we do know that he wanted to control a lot of the messages that came out of his football program, which tracks because that's exactly what he did in Junction, and that's exactly what he did in Kentucky too.
Well, here's some things about things that we know from the players' perspectives. Different sports where players integrated schools in the Deep South. And I'll preface it by saying that the George Wallace segregation forever speech was made at an SEC football game, as was the famous Ross Barnett speech about drawing a line, about never budging on segregation or Jim Crow. That was made at an SEC football game. So these things are not separate from the governance of their states and the leadership of the football coaches and their relationships with the men and women who ran the states. And in many instances they were close, and in some instances it was suggested that the college football coaches in those states were popular enough to run for governor themselves. I interviewed several gentlemen who coached at institutions such as the University of Georgia, Southwestern Louisiana, Louisiana Tech, and Tulane when they integrated their college basketball programs. I also interviewed gentlemen like Hollis Temple, who was the first Black player, one of the first Black players at LSU, the first Black players at the University of Georgia, the first Black players at Louisiana Tech and Southwestern Louisiana, to get their perspectives on what it was like at those programs to be the first Black players in terms of boosters, fans, media, teammates, and coaches. So I talked to Dale Brown, Scotty Robertson, Beryl Shipley, people like that, the gentlemen that were coaching at those schools in Louisiana and Georgia. The account that I got from the Beryl Shipleys and Dale Browns and Scotty Roberts of the world about how we looked after the young man, we made sure that the hate mail, that they were sheltered from, negative media, that their transitions went smoothly, that I was very protective of them. And the version I got from the Collis Temples of the world and the Mike Greens of the world, who integrated Louisiana Tech, and the guys that were at Southwest Louisiana, were almost like night and day. Like they didn't watch out for us. They couldn't police what was happening to us 24/7. Nobody can protect your back, when you're going to the store, to the laundry, or to the movies. There's nothing the coach can do about your day-to-day activities. And also, a couple of players shared with me, although this is not football, I'm just giving you the lay of the land and integrating a southern university in a major college sport. Some players shared with me that they were encouraged to take puff courses to stay eligible when they really wanted to take a more challenging curriculum based on either what they wanted to do for a living after their basketball careers, or something that they had been interested in high school, particularly Collis Temple at LSU. So, whatever a Bear Bryant might tell you that they're going to do in terms of watching out for you on campus and making sure that you're not the subject of any, undue discrimination or targets, for hate mail or cat calls or things of that nature. One, to Tom's point, it's not something you can really control. And two, just from me interviewing those several coaches and several players, I got a totally different version of what the players actually experienced and how protective the coaches said that they thought they had been of those players.
Yeah. Yeah, and I could tell you a few similar stories about Wilbur Hackett at Kentucky and the other schools. Let's start to wrap things up. It's a tough uphill battle that for some reason the sports media, I've said this before and I'll say it again, the sports media has failed this at both ends of the spectrum. The early 1960s sports media avoided race and these milestones weren't covered. The modern sports media doesn't accept the facts that that I've dug up in my books and that others have reported, that Kevin's come across with his dissertation and his teaching as a college professor at South Carolina. The media sticks to Bear Bryant's hagiography. And I want to make this point, and then I'm going to wrap it up, ask Kevin for his final comments and Bijan to bring us home. I want to make this one final comment. Remember, I said Auburn recruited James Owens. He was a freshman in 1969. That was 1 year before the national media and folklore gives credit to Bryant for breaking ground in 1970 with Wilbur Jackson. Nobody fired Auburn coach Ralph Shug Jordan, and James Owens had a great career. At Auburn, they have the James Owens Courage Award. And when they did a documentary that Tom Gossam headed up on James Owens, former coaches and athletic directors say on film, Auburn should have done more. They should have done it earlier, and they shouldn't have made James Owens come in as the only black kid on the team, which is what Alabama did with Bear Bryant, with Wilbur Jackson. So my point is, Auburn apologizes for the 1960s. Alabama continues to make this folklore and sell Bear Bryant's myth. Kevin, your final comments, and then Bijan.
Yeah, I think that the University of Alabama has a weird relationship with apologies, especially when it comes to its racist past. It's still, it wasn't until 2 or 3 years ago, authoring Lucy Jackson, who has a plaque outside of the English department or English building, was recognized by the university as the first female black student
not Vivian Malone
to earn a degree at the UA. it is mind-boggling that here we are. That was 3 years ago, so 2022, right? I was a student there. um, um, it is hard to imagine that the university is going to accelerate its very necessary apologia to the various students and faculty that they need to apologize to. With that said, I think that there's a lot that they could do. I know that the university put a very, it's interesting. I'm trying to find, I was trying to find a photo while we were talking, but I might need a little bit more time to find it. When the university recognized Wilbur Jackson and John Mitchell, they put out that video that I talked about earlier. The university helped curate that. There was a big spectacle where Nick Saban, who was still coaching at the time, had like a thing with under a tent right in front of the steps of Bryant-Denny Stadium, and they put a plaque outside of the Bryant-Denny Stadium that is about the size of my laptop. It's about 16 inches long. This is a 16-inch long golden plaque. It's about 16 by 10, right? On this entire ginormous stadium. And it is only feet away from the 7+ feet tall statues of all of the different coaches that have coached at the University of Alabama and Champions Walkway, as they call it, right? I think that if the university is going to apologize more, they should be more considerate to how those apologies are curated and how they materialize, because it's interesting that there's a tiny blip of a plaque on an entire stadium named after a man that could have recruited them many years earlier, and is just feet away from a statue that is supposedly the tallest statue of all of the other statues. They made sure of that. They made sure that Bryant's statue was taller than Gene Stallings and all of the above. I don't know how. I'm more of a. I feel like I'm a diagnostician. I can sense when things are wrong, but I don't know what the university can do to really right this. But I know what they have tried was a very poor attempt. It was tokenizing at best, and does not tell the full story. And so I don't really know what they should do, but I do know what they have done is more. It's not enough.
Yeah. Let me slip in one more comment, Bajan, before I hand it off to you. Talking about Nick Saban. Nick Saban knows what Duffy Daugherty did at Michigan State because he used to teach his assistant coaches about it. He knows how Duffy Daugherty led the way. And I'm going to write about this in a future story. When that plaque was unveiled that Kevin's talking about with Wilbur Jackson and John Mitchell, Nick Saban gives out quotes about how brave these two guys were and how forward thinking Bear Bryant was. And it just strikes me as ironic that Nick Saban, his players, could never put one over on him. But the University of Alabama has put one over on him about Bear Bryant's history because Bear Bryant deserves none of that credit. And Duffy Daugherty deserves all of it. Bajan, your final comments. Bring us home.
Well, I think that at the beginning of this podcast or show, you referenced Paul Feinbaum, and you said that you were aware that he believed your version of the Bear Bryant involvement or lack thereof in terms of the Sam Cunningham game. But when you said that, I thought about how people say that you can have your own beliefs, but you can't have your own facts. It's not really up to the Feinbaums of the world to believe something or not. It's up to the fact that we know that Bob Grant played college football. We know that Nate Northington played college football. We know that Lenny Lyles played college football. And we also know that Kentucky is considered a border state. And in a border state, like Lenny Lyles playing at the University of Louisville as a black running back in the mid-1950s and actually being a star, it's actually arguably easier to introduce black players into the program than it would have been for Bryant at Alabama, if you want to make the case that, okay, he doesn't necessarily do it until the late 60s and early 70s at Bama. Well, Kentucky, where Rupp held sway, and could have had Wes Unseld, but Unseld didn't feel like he wanted him, so Unseld goes to Louisville. Louisville is signing these athletes before Kentucky. Houston is signing these athletes before Texas. SMU is signing Levias before Texas. So Auburn is signing Owens. So it's not as cut and dried as people are making it like, oh, it's the Deep South, or it's this state or that state, or this governor or that governor. It's the coaches, and the coaches had young men that they were aware of their talent. They knew about the SWAC. They knew about the SIAC. And they knew about these guys in the Deep South that were, running 700-yard dashes in high school and had good hands and were, enormous quick linemen like Bubba Smith in the state of Texas. They knew about these people because they knew the Black coaches, and they went to the same clinics, and they gave clinics to those coaches. But they didn't want to be groundbreakers. They didn't want to incur the wrath of the boosters. They didn't want to incur the wrath of the alumni and the press by being the first.
Yeah, and as the great Sam Lacey said, talking about baseball and integration, he's afraid many of the owners and general managers and managers felt the same way. Okay, well,
yeah. Why should I be the first? Why should I be the person with the neck on the chopping block? Like you said, Shug Gordon didn't get fired.
Yeah. Okay.
Shug Jordan.
Shug Jordan. Yeah. Thanks for a fascinating discussion. Kevin, spread this word the best you can in the academic world. It's great to have somebody with a lot more academic chops than me agreeing with me, because I don't find many people from Alabama. Actually, I let me correct myself. I do find a lot of people in the South that agree with me. They just won't admit it publicly. So thanks for watching the End Game. Share this with as many of your friends as you can. And we have a documentary, thanks to my friend here, Bajan Bing, catching on the work I've been doing in my books, Ray of Light and The Right Thing to Do. We have a documentary in development with the fundraising stage, Game Changers of the Century. When it comes out, is going to be the most honest and complete look at college football integration. Thanks for watching.